let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike.
This is preeminently the time to speak the truth, the whole truth, frankly and boldly.
History doesn't have to be boring, buttoned up, or inaccessible. And it certainly didn't end in 1945. It belongs to all of us, and we share and add to it every day. Welcome to the History A Go-Go podcast, where I interview interesting guests, cover a motley crew of topics, and it's a place where you can sit, think, and drink all at the same time. I'm your host, Rob Mellon. My guest today is Dr. Andrew Burstein. He is the Charles P. Manship Professor of History at Louisiana State University. He is a professional historian who has been featured on several programs over the years, including on C-SPAN's American President series and Book Notes with Brian Lamb. He has also worked as a consultant on Ken Burns' documentary film on Thomas Jefferson. He has written several books, to include works on Washington Irving, James Madison, and Thomas Jefferson. Other titles include Cultural History of America's Literal Dreams, Lincoln Dreamt He Died, The Midnight Visions of Remarkable Americans from Colonial Times to Freud, published in 2013, and The Passions of Andrew Jackson, published in 2003. His book, The Problem of Democracy, The President's Atoms Confront the Cult of Personality, which he co-authored with his partner, Dr. Nancy Isenberg, will be the topic of discussion today. Welcome, Dr. Burstein.
Good to be with you, Rob.
So in your book, The Problem of Democracy, along with Dr. Isenberg, you cover two similar American figures, but they're similarly misunderstood also.
Yes, they are misunderstood. First of all, the important, essential fact is that they were the first of only two pairs of father-son presidents. And John Quincy Adams was president of the United States. We creatively call them 2 and 6, the way the Bushes used to refer to themselves as 41 and 43. John Quincy Adams was in his one-term presidency when his father died. So his father got to live to see his son inaugurated as president. And although John Quincy Adams' presidency, like his father's, ended in ignominy, at least the beginning, while his father was alive, was a very positive and encouraging beginning to what turned out to be an unsuccessful presidency through no fault of his. John Adams probably can be discredited in some ways because he made some choices as president that proved to be politically unpopular, and he did a disservice to himself with, most famously, the Alien and Sedition Acts, which history looks back on and sees as going against the First Amendment of the Constitution by locking up political dissenters, mostly newspaper editors who wrote critically about the government. And this was all a result of the panic in America over the French Revolution and how it could spill over to American shores. John Quincy Adams as president, his lack of success had more to do with the rise of Jacksonianism, and to go with the subtitle of the book, the cult of personality surrounding Andrew Jackson. Like George Washington, John Adams's predecessor, he was not particularly learned, and although he had been a lawyer and a judge, Jackson was not learned. He did not read George Washington had this aura about him, the father of the country. And John Adams was not only in his shadow as vice president for 8 years, but as president, he would always be compared unfavorably to the man he succeeded.
It is tradition here, Dr. Burstein, to accompany the conversation with a special brew. In honor of the President's Adams, and in the spirit of 1776, we have Sam 76 from Samuel Adams. No stranger to revolutions, Samuel Adams has once again mirrored the rebellious traits of its namesake and crafted Sam 76. It's a refreshing and flavorful union of lager and ale. And I'll just say it's pretty tasty. Now, the best way to enjoy the History A Go-Go podcast is to grab the featured beer for yourself and join the discussion. You can suggest a special brew for a future episode by subscribing to the podcast wherever you get your podcast, like our Facebook page, and leave a comment. And for those of you who've decided to join us today, cheers. Democracy itself is the central theme of your book, and there's several styles of democracy that are referenced in American history: Jeffersonian democracy, Jacksonian democracy. But is it all just a myth? Did the framers even create a democracy in the first place?
Great question. No, democracies, as James Madison wrote of them and others did as well, democracies were understood at the time of the founding as the ancient Greek form of government that could exist in a small place. So in a democracy, people meet in person to exercise a vote, to exercise their will. America was established not as democracy, but as a republic. And in a republic, we work through our elected representatives. What the Adamses, and especially John Adams, the father, did was to reclassify in terms that made sense at the time of the Constitutional Convention when he was writing as a political thinker or political philosopher. And I really think that that's probably the best way to understand these two guys is as students of political philosophy. John Adams discussed in historical terms democracy, monarchy, aristocracy, republicanism. And his fears, what could happen if the American Republic veered off course, if it was out of balance, if there was too much authority in a quasi-monarchical president or an aristocratic, a moneyed aristocracy in the Senate. Remember, the Senate was appointed by state legislatures and not elected popularly until the 20th century, until 1913. So in the time of the first Adams's presidency, and throughout the 1790s, as an opposition party arose, something that the founders did not anticipate because there's no mention in the Constitution of organized political parties. They just assumed that someone like Washington, that a figure who was generally respected, would be elected through the convoluted electoral college, not a direct popular election. That's a 19th century innovation. So it was far less democratic than we even imagine our country to be now. It was not intended to be democratic as we understand it now, but it was intended in Adamsian terms to be a balanced system, which meant and this is what the word federal means, or federative, as a principle, as a political principle. It's the sharing of power between the national government and the state and local governments. And it's apart from political parties. which is one of the main reasons why the Adamses never identified themselves as members of the political party. They wanted to cast their vote the way they thought in a representative democracy. We should, the elected representatives should, not on the basis of a party unity or a party bloc, but their individual, what is in the best interest of the people whom they serve most directly, their constituency. So as political thinkers, the Adamses were developing a nonpartisan ideal, which they espoused, but really very precious few other national leaders did.
Well, it's not politically advantageous to do that. I mean, that becomes clear.
Yeah. Yes. And what they called party spirit, or the spirit of party, was a concept that went back to the Spectator essays of Addison and Steele from 1710, 1711, the colonial period, that were read by every young man with any sort of social ambition, any sort of political ambition, in the 1780s and 1790s and into the 19th century. And as Addison wrote of the spirit of party, it was this destructive, destabilizing of good order, was the root of all political evil were parties. So you didn't want to call yourself the member of a party. And initially, the Federalists and the Jeffersonian, Madisonian Republicans referred to themselves as interests. They didn't want to use the word party because party had a bad connotation, as did the word Democrat. To be called a Democrat in the 1790s. And it wasn't until Jefferson was elected into the 19th century that the party began to proudly call themselves Democrats, because in the 1790s, a Democrat was akin to what the right wing today is calling anarchists. Mob rule, people in the streets. That was democracy. It was people run amok.
Like the French Revolution. So they have that in their time period that they can view, and they know what, say, unfettered democracy can result in. That's their fear.
Yes, that is precisely their fear. And they use the word mob rule or mobocracy. It sounds like a modern invention, but really the word mobocracy comes from that period. And it's all about destabilizing. It's, disruptive. And there is this kind of class dynamic where you would get these sort of, people, saucy boys coming into the streets and throwing rocks through windows. And so there's kind of the idea of not just disloyalty to a presidential administration, but actually destabilizing a proper social order. And it's there's so many of the fears and anxieties that were exhibited by politicized Americans in the early years of the Republic are still resonating in different ways with us today, because what we just saw recently in Portland and where a few looters were identified as kind of the leaders of some vast conspiracy or movement to defund or undo the good that an organized police force does. This kind of and I'm not weighing in on what's a correct interpretation of these events that took place in 2020. I'm saying that the same level of outlandish fear-mongering feeds election campaigns, and did so in 1796 and 1800, and would continue to. the controversies are very often, and this gets back to the Adams perspective. The controversies that occur and are, sort of in the moment, will be forgotten when the next fearful event or prospect arises. But at that very moment, it seems like there's nothing else that the press can focus on. And this was the case with the powerful newspapers of 1796 or 1800. And the Adams administration, it began in Congress, a Federalist Congress, but Adams himself signed the legislation. So the Alien Sedition Act, which could lock up and fine, sizable fines, anyone who was heard in public or who published anything against the government, critical of the government. Where does that come from? We know where that comes from. That seems to be baked in to the American political system. So some people will say, then and now, some people said that it was a function of democracy, that is to say, destabilizing good social order. And so democracy is used both as, this is what makes America special. This is what makes us exceptional, is that we're the first modern democracy. And, it's a loose use of a term that we all love, because now democracy only means something good. But the same thing that was called democracy as mob rule is called anarchy today. So as a historian, I see all of these parallels and ways in which the founding generation continues to speak to us as we, work our way through day-to-day scandals and day-to-day anxieties that are blown out of proportion by the constant media and the Twitter sphere. They just had fewer media to be concerned about in their 3-mile-an-hour world. But the emotional concerns of our early leaders I see them being aired in only slightly different language. That we don't call it the spirit of party anymore. We call it, what do we call it? When a party is just, towing the line and refusing to act in a bipartisan way.
Just party loyalty.
Yeah, party loyalty. So the Adamses understood and wrote about passion as a function of political society, and that you needed a system put in place that would prevent the natural passions of human beings from being displayed in destructive ways. So that's why you need the federative principle to operate for balanced government, combining the elements of the three forms: democracy, aristocracy, monarchy. So you need some kind, and for Adams, and the reason why the Adamses were branded as conservative, which really doesn't mean anything in the terms that it's used, they were branded as conservative rather than what I would say independent-minded, because they didn't just go with the Jeffersonian optimistic pronouncement about how the American people are somehow morally superior to those of the old world, that we were creating a new form of government that the rest of the world was going to look at in awe and do their best to adopt, the export of American democracy, the representative democracy. But for the Adamses, passions that were not properly controlled through the institutions of government would allow a demagogue to rise, someone who would know how to speak soft words to the people, but in fact had a kind of monarchical aims in mind. And so,
does that lead to your the premise of your book about their combating the cult of personality? Of course, they had to deal with individuals in their time period who were beloved and could, in some circumstances, if they wanted to, use that position in society to assume power, because that's what's happened in world history throughout all of pretty much human history. So there was a fear of that. So could you explain the fear the Adams, both of them had, and the cult of personality?
George Washington was properly, history has properly given kudos to Washington for resisting power, for resisting a kind of monarchical trappings. Most famously, his decision that others have followed to step down after 2 terms in office so as not to be king-like. And that's true. But Washington was also, as John Adams privately wrote, someone who was merely approved of because of the aura that was created around him, because it was something that people needed, and that he was of an ordinary intellect. He was not an orator. He did not have strong ideas about legislative initiatives. He wasn't an innovator. He wasn't an expert. He was a military general. And we have consistently in our country's history, as Adams presciently observed, elected people with no political identity, like Zachary Taylor, Ulysses S. Grant, Dwight Eisenhower, who both Democrats and Republicans wanted. He elected to go with the Republicans, but could have gone as well with the Democrats. He wasn't partisan. So you have a party that desires power, looking for a leader who, and Jackson, of course, whose military exploits lead to a cult of personality. In Washington's case, the people who knew Washington best did not publicly, say anything about his lack of intellect, his modest intellect. And John Adams and Washington got along quite well, although Adams had very little input into the 8 years of the Washington administration. And Abigail Adams and Martha Washington were fond of one another. So there's no personal animus there. In the case of John Adams and Benjamin Franklin,
I was going to ask you about that too. That was going to be my next question, because now you have a completely different individual who really his intellect can't be denied that vociferously, because he does have a pretty staunch intellect. Yes,
but Adams really goes to town again on Benjamin Franklin. They knew each other quite well. Benjamin Franklin famously said, and it was repeated by many, the John Adams was a great patriot, loved his country, but at times he was absolutely mad, and he really thought that John Adams, speaking of political passions, just had this kind of personal temperament that was the opposite of what you needed as a diplomat. And Franklin and Adams met, well, not for the first time, but they met up in 1778 and again in 1779 in Paris, as the two most sort of the opposites, I guess you would say, on the American negotiating team that eventually ended with the Treaty of Paris and the recognition of American independence by Britain. But on the road to that, Adams felt that Benjamin Franklin had lost his mojo, that he was in the pocket of the French foreign minister and was just trying to please everyone and enjoying his, sort of the women who flocked around him, that he was living the life of kind of this, licentious playboy type guy, in spite of his age and gout, but that he was being taken advantage of, and that when the Treaty of Paris was finalized, Franklin would get all the credit, and Adams is clearly, envious of his reputation, Franklin's reputation. He was writing letters to the members of the Congress back in Philadelphia, including the Foreign Affairs Secretary, and telling everyone outright that Franklin is losing this for us. Franklin is in the pocket of the French, and they don't want to help us. They want to see us remain weak. And I'm the only strong negotiator, and I should be in charge of this, and, just belittling Franklin in every way possible. And he continued to do this even after Franklin's death, recognizing Franklin's contribution to, the study of electricity. And as a pop philosopher, he had his day. But Adams felt that Franklin was all fluff, that in the times when he was most famous in the world as the first American who was celebrated abroad, that it was all just puffery and there was no substance to it. John Quincy Adams fought the cult of personality.
How much of it is he's just got a different style? Because it seems to me that in diplomacy, there are times where things can get accomplished at a party that can't get accomplished over a table, for example, and really hard-nosed negotiations like Adams is interested in. How much of it is just style?
Well, that's another good question, because Franklin, in fact, was a good diplomat in the way of his, yes, the French found him accommodating. The French found Adams overbearing. And what Franklin's success in diplomacy was owing to was his knowing how not to offend people. And John Adams, even when he wasn't trying to offend people, offended people. He didn't have that, any charisma. He knew this, and he grumbled about it his whole life. And it's funny because the apple doesn't fall far from the tree.
Right. The other thing about it is I was wondering if I always viewed, and I might be incorrect, but I always viewed Adams and then John Quincy Adams similarly, that they spend their whole lives in preparation and study and philosophy, and then it just gets outdone by sheer charisma. And that has to bother them, and they're not viewed as successful presidents, so they spend their entire life planning, preparing, reading, studying, and then they get into the positions of power, and they're relatively inept.
Not inept, but
politically
unable
unsuccessful.
to build political alliances that. There's a reason why we don't say the age of Adams, that we say the age of Jefferson or the age of Jackson, because of the dynamism, the cult of personality, and that celebrity, to a certain extent, Franklin and Jackson, less so Washington, Franklin and Jackson contributed to the, they had their handlers, and they knew that they were complicit in the exaggeration of their personal qualities. But to a certain extent, celebrity in this country is manipulated by others and outside the personal control of the historical actor himself. So we know that fame, like money, can corrupt. And what was done with Franklin and Washington and Jackson was that their handlers, the people who, their image handlers, showed them as modest men whose inherent genius catapulted them so that they became larger than life. That it wasn't ambition, but sort of an acquiescence to the public's adoration of them. And, that's part of the mythology that drives American political celebrity. We, and again, this is how the age of Adams, the age of Adamses, still speaks to us. We have done very little analysis as a people, and this includes, our modern interpreters, our talking heads on the news channels and all. We've done too little analysis of the susceptibility of our electorate. We bask in the sunshine of our democratic ideals, but the susceptibility of the electorate to the sensation of the moment, instead of looking for leaders who are problem solvers, we want leaders who are heroes. We somehow demand that they save us from a threat. So we may see some effort, for example, right now with environmental initiatives, that it's a crisis that we have to steel ourselves to, that we have to address through expertise. And that's, very Adams. Or a public health crisis, obviously. But otherwise, the Adamses, if they ran on something, it was improvement, which back in the day meant internal improvement. It meant, building roads and canals and railroads and commercially linking this great country together. It was the reason for the Louisiana Purchase was to acquire the Gulf port of New Orleans, and that the entire Mississippi would be, allow for Western commercial growth, agricultural growth, and American raw materials being sold through New Orleans. A considerable, I think it was something like close to a third of America's exports were going through New Orleans to in the early mid-19th century to Europe. So competence isn't titillating. Competence is not a shining object. Improvement is not something that anyone runs on. And today, it's even worse because big money legally buys our elections. And so, of course, the stature of the candidate is going to be exploited with all the technology and all the money that's brought to bear. So the critique of the Adamses, of the cult of personality, is prescient in a lot of ways. And if we think of John McCain as a maverick, as someone who was capable of putting country above party, that phrase, is another that resonates with me when I think of what the Adamses were trying to do. And they were never given credit for that, right? So John Adams made some mistakes as president.
Well, they lived their whole life. They grew up in an environment where that's what they were taught, the idea of civic virtue, and that when you're called by your country or the people around you for the betterment of everyone, you respond to that call. They learned that from when they were little children.
Yeah, that's very true. And Americans, even the most ambitious, did not feel like it was about earning money, because lawyers didn't get rich then. I mean, Alexander Hamilton had to leave this as Secretary of the Treasury to go back and practice the law because he was in financial straits. He needed, it wasn't as though these people, the only way they were becoming wealthy was investing in land. And sometimes that would bankrupt them because land speculation was a big gamble back then. A lot of our founders died in debt. George Washington being one of the few who was comfortable, materially comfortable. The others, spent beyond their means and borrowed and co-signed on their friends' loans and things like that, and got into big trouble. So the Adamses were about doing everything with moderation and being suspect of get rich quick, suspect of sort of radical solutions to that the cult of celebrity, envelops the country, and this idea of electing a hero, of someone who's going to solve all our problems, which speaks to the balance again that they believed in. Because if you expect someone to solve all your problems, you are giving them a kind of king-like power to look to the president as a savior. And it's not party specific, because Barack Obama was treated by Democrats, who perhaps are per capita, a higher percentage are college educated than Republican voters at this moment. But Barack Obama was treated as a savior.
Well, and there's no question that the Republicans used the idea of celebrity against him.
Yeah. And, politics being politics, we underplay in promoting our democratic impulses. We underplay the desire to have celebrity leaders, to have savior leaders. And we don't acknowledge that there is actually a yearning for royalty. The Kennedys being another great example, or Hollywood royalty. Nepotism is rife in America. Look at all the names in politics on both sides of the aisle: Bush, Cuomo, Kennedy.
Dr. Burstein, what happens there, it not only happens at the national level. If you go down to the local level in the states and the communities, the same thing happens. And you have these families who've been in power for multiple years. They may be a state representative or a state senator, but so was their father or their mother. And so it happens not only at the national level, but at the state and local level too.
You're right. And I just think that the Adamses stood for national introspection, and they were criticized for not buying in to the ideals, to the idealism. Yet, I should have mentioned this earlier, it was John Quincy Adams, when he was Secretary of State for 8 years under James Monroe. John Quincy Adams, right, who the opposite party from his father, so that talks about his independence. John Quincy Adams, as Secretary of State, was the first national figure to refer in public in a speech to the United States as a representative democracy. So the person who you would least think would be the one to popularize the idea that America is a democracy based on the previous targeting of those called Democrats or anarchists. He's the one, as Secretary of State, who is welcoming us to see the democratic in our political and cultural identity, that there's something, that they understood that the words all men are created equal were not literal, that created equal in truth is true only to the extent that human beings will agree on a particular division of power. We have these words that we don't dissect and should. Freedom, equality, inalienable rights, justice. These are not universals, right? And the best that we can do in an Adamsian mindset is to understand group psychology, to understand sham worship of an individual.
And I was going to ask you about, we spend a good deal of time talking about John Adams and kind of veered into John Quincy Adams, but dealing with Jackson, that phrase, Jacksonian democracy, and the participation of more individuals, obviously not women or people of color, but it does increase during that time period. And I think in your book, I don't know in your book, but is it mentioned as almost as a sham democracy, that it's not really based on that Jackson is more interested in ambition. He uses patronage. There's corruption, which he claimed that John Quincy Adams was involved in, and then just personal power, which of course is against democracy.
Right. Jackson does embody personal power. It's the reason why the Whig Party formed. It was a party that was the first political party to come into existence as the anti-Jackson party. I mean, it was a party designed to unseat one man. It was all about Jackson because, and the iconography of the period of the 1830s featured Jackson in kingly robes with a crown on his head, King Andrew I. And he did, use his cabinet as a collection of yes men. He dismissed his entire first cabinet over a scandal, a sex scandal, which we need not get into, and replaced it with yes men. That's what he wanted, and I know it sounds. I'm not going to, make the analogies to Trump's cabinet, but a lot of people in my field in early American history have been relating the phenomenon of Jackson and the phenomenon of Trump, in that Jackson was not, he responded from the gut. He thought that he embodied the will of the people. He did not respect the ordinary white people who lionized him. And he loved the crowds, the thousands that came out to see him. He went up to New York, or he traveled from Nashville to Washington. So he relished that kind of adulation, but not in a sick way. But he did see himself as the embodiment of the will of the people. And yet, when it came to the actual practice of democracy, this was your question, he literally opposed universal white male voting in Tennessee. He was not, he was the representative of the plantation elite, the Southern plantation elite. He was the hero of many more people, but he only really cared about people like him, scrappy white kids who, worked hard enough to afford a slave and
sheer will and determination and hard work, and of course that seeps its way into American political thought.
Yeah, he didn't have to. He was kind of a rags to riches story, and I mean he wasn't wealthy probably until almost the time he was elected president. He wasn't young. In fact, he and John Quincy Adams were the same age. They were both born in 1767. So they were both shaped by the experience of growing up during the American Revolution. And the one thing I think that made them comparable as historical figures is that they saw the American Revolution as the momentous event of their lifetimes, and that they did both believe in American exceptionalism as we understand the term today, and so their patriotism maybe went along parallel paths, even though their personal experience. I mean, Jackson never went to Europe. He didn't see the world. He's a Westerner. He's a frontier hero. And John Quincy Adams, served as Secretary of State, as U.S. Senator from Massachusetts, as the minister. We didn't have ambassadorial rank then, but as minister to Great Britain, to the Netherlands. George Washington first appointed JQA when he was still in his 20s as the minister to the Netherlands, which is the same position that his father had inaugurated in 1780. Why? Because they were the bankers of Europe, and the American Revolution couldn't be won without borrowing money from abroad. So the Adamses were a part of every significant development from the Revolution forward. And if you think about the lifetimes of those two, John Adams, born 1735,
it's amazing. It's amazing that you treated both of them, because it takes that time period through the colonial time period, the revolutionary time period, all the way to the antebellum period, because I think John Quincy Adams dies in 1848 or something like that in Congress.
48.
Right?
He dies at his death. Yeah, no other president has done this. Gone into Congress as a mere representative in the House after serving as president of the United States to spend the last 17 years of his life, sitting at a desk in Congress. He dies at the age of 80 at his desk at the end of the Mexican-American War. So, the two of them, their lives span so much of the developmental decades of American history. John Quincy Adams does not become an anti-slavery fixture in our historical memory of anti-slavery until the 1830s. And then he becomes one of the most outspoken voices, although typical of him, typical of them, he doesn't belong to any anti-slavery society. It's all about his individual, nonpartisan, I'm not going to belong to any interest group, but I'm going to weigh each issue on the basis of my moral understanding, my education, my constituency. If they don't like what I say, they don't have to reelect me. But he's all about problem solving. He's saying, what moral problems do we have? What financial problems do we have? How do I promote a reasonable solution? And he was in favor of a more active federal government, which is why he's aligning with the Whig interest. And the Democrats were the small government party, the Jacksonians, for the most part. of, you don't interfere with slavery at the local level.
Against the national bank
to exercise. Yeah, right.
Those types of things. Sure, absolutely. I was going to ask you about John Quincy Adams' presidency, because some of the things he does seems very, modern. Investing in things for the future, science. I think he builds an observatory. And of course, he gets criticized. The nation's not ready for those types of ideas and spending money on those types of endeavors. But it seems forward-thinking. But what goes wrong in his presidency, John Quincy Adams? Does he even have a chance? Well, is it a case where obviously he really didn't. 1824, he gets elected by the House of Representatives. He didn't have the most popular votes and electoral votes, and obviously no one did. So the House of Representatives determined it. And then Jackson almost immediately starts campaigning. Maybe there's nothing he could have done in 1828 to win.
True. And boy, thanks for synthesizing the election of 1824, because I wouldn't have been able to do it so quickly, so concisely. So the election is thrown into the House. And even though John Quincy Adams has 15 fewer electoral votes, so 84 to 99 for Jackson, the congressional delegations for each of the states are persuaded by longtime Speaker of the House Henry Clay, who was an on-again, off-again opponent of John Quincy Adams, persuaded the border states, the swing states, as it were, persuaded to vote en masse for Adams, because Henry Clay says Jackson is a military chieftain. That's all he is. He has those kind of, king-like ambitions, and he doesn't know anything, and you can't trust him. Whereas at least you know what John Quincy Adams is all about. And John Quincy Adams then turns around, and as soon as, literally within a week of when the congressional delegations vote him into office, supplanting the popular vote, which went in Jackson's favor, JQA turns around and names Henry Clay his Secretary of State. It's known as the corrupt bargain. And it haunts the two of them. The political caricatures show, JQA and Henry Clay as sort of conspiratorial, with the caption, Adams has feet of clay, that he's, manipulated by Clay, and Clay is a real bad guy, and that this was corruption. So the Jacksonians in Congress, who have a majority, will not accept any good idea that comes from the executive branch. And so as progressive, as forward-looking as John Quincy Adams's presidential program was, he couldn't get anything accomplished. And the reason why naming Clay Secretary of State is seemingly, ostensibly, a reward for getting JQA elected, why that matters is because at that time, being Secretary of State meant what being Vice President means today, that you're next in line.
So you're not only choosing a president, you're choosing the next one.
The most likely next one, right? Jefferson had been Washington's Secretary of State. Madison was Jefferson's Secretary of State. Monroe was Madison's Secretary of State. JQA was Monroe's Secretary of State. So, you've got this pattern, and suddenly JQA is president in 1825, and he names Clay Secretary of State. We know that Clay's ambitious because he runs for president 3 different times. And he is the anti-Jackson symbol. So, as you say, nothing good came out of the Adams presidency because Congress and the executive were at loggerheads. and they were only looking to subvert John Quincy Adams and speed up his demise and make sure that Andrew Jackson got elected. And that's what happened.
So the last question I have for you, Dr. Burstein, is if we could just describe what is Adamsian democracy?
Well,
is that a tough? Did I not give you enough time?
Yeah. Well, it's tough in that the ambiguity of the term democracy, the historicizing of the term democracy, makes it hard to explain this simply. But there are the people, and then there are a subset of the whole people in the Adamsian view. The male head of household represented an entire family and was the only qualified voter. There was only ever representation. So the male head of household represents the family. And that a democracy? Is the family a democracy?
That's come up in recent times. I've seen people say they've advocated that the household should get one vote. And I'm like, that's odd, but then you bring it up and it's got roots that go back pretty far.
Yeah, it means that democracy is only inclusive in that our government recognizes the reality of hierarchy. So the idea of popular sovereignty is legal fiction. The idea of representative government is the closest to real democracy that America gets. And that's Adamsian democracy. It's recognizing popular sovereignty as a legal fiction. He's comfortable, John Quincy Adams is comfortable calling it a representative democracy, but it's a representative democracy that accepts certain hierarchical forms. Probably, going back to the father, the best way to look at it is balanced government.
Well, isn't that the real challenge of democracy and why it's difficult? Because it requires that balance. Because what Adams, both of them are trying to accomplish, seems very difficult to accomplish. You don't want unfettered democracy, but you also don't want like an oligarchy or aristocracy or even a monarchy, definitely not that. So you want this middle ground, and there's all of these interests that are pushing and pulling, and now you have parties. It just seems very messy and very difficult to implement.
Who is the best representative of democracy? Who is the best representative of the best interest of the most people? It's, how do you define that? I mean, we've never been able to define what that kind of social justice looks like. But it's how we are constantly trying to redefine ourselves as a people. And it's how the Adamses were honest and as critical thinkers, challenging the myths of American democracy even before they had time to evolve. It's convenient to say that democracy is majority rule, but it's not. Jefferson actually said it quite well in his first inaugural address, that in order to be fair, the majority will had to accommodate, and I'm paraphrasing here, minority interests. And, that's also Adamsian democracy. And it's curious that the Adamses saw Jefferson positively and negatively. There's unlike the Franklin model or the Jackson model, Jefferson was the charismatic figure who both Adamses could see some legitimacy in, some intellectual promise in, because the Jefferson of the Declaration of Independence captured the democratic spirit in the way the revolutionary John Adams and the American exceptionalist John Quincy Adams both agreed with, that the Declaration of Independence is as much a founding document and a statement of the American political spirit as the Constitution itself. The Constitution is more concerned, of course, with the balance, the three branches of government and the federative principle. But the Declaration of Independence to John Quincy Adams was more than just the buzzwords. It's not a fable. It's not just an ideal. He sees principle that could expand upon and realize the good, majority rule, minority rights ideal that Jefferson articulates there and in his first inaugural address. So I guess the bottom line is that politics has always been uncomfortable and a competition. And unfortunately, the best metaphor for politics today is the game metaphor. It's a horse race. We have buzzwords like freedom and liberty, but unless we are introspective and honest about our failings and focus on problem solving as the Adamses did, father and son, if we can't admit what's wrong and seek solutions that make life better for as much of the population as possible, then we're not living up to the founders' true purposes in fashioning a representative democracy.
Well, Dr. Burstein, I really enjoyed it, and I appreciate you coming on today.
Well, I enjoyed the conversation. Your questions were spot on, and I hope that I answered them effectively enough that your audience will enjoy the hour.
Thank you. I'd like to thank my guest today, Dr. Andrew Burstein, for the entwined stories of John Adams and John Quincy Adams and how they confronted the cult of personality to protect our democracy. The featured brew in the spirit of 1776 was Sam 76 from the revolutionary brewery Samuel Adams of Boston. If you are interested in Dr. Burstein's book, The Problem of Democracy, just click the link in the description below to place an order. The music was provided by the great Bones Fork, who are working on new music as we speak. Remember to subscribe to the podcast and leave a review, and like our Facebook page and leave a comment. More engaging guests and compelling topics are planned, so join us again next time when we talk, think, and dream on History A Go-Go.